At 1:47 in the morning, every goose on the north side of Rowan Trask's farm started screaming at once. Not the low, irritated grumble they made when a delivery truck came down the gravel road at dusk. Not the scattered honking that answered every stray dog barking 3 farms over. This was something else entirely. Sharp, urgent bursts, one after another, 14 throats sounding off in the same rhythm in the same direction, loud enough to reach across the pasture and pull a sleeping man out of a dead sleep nearly half a mile away. Rowan sat up in bed. He listened for 3 seconds. Then he was already reaching for the jeans folded over the chair. His wife Isolde turned on the lamp beside her. Her hair was loose against the pillow silver where it had once been dark, and her eyes carried the particular alertness of a woman who had learned over 40 years of marriage that when her husband moved that fast in the middle of the night, the reason mattered. What is it? He was already lacing his boots. The North Flock. That doesn't tell me anything. It tells me enough. He grabbed the flashlight from the shelf beside the door, stepped out onto the porch, and stopped for one long second to look toward the dark line of elderberry rows beyond the barn. The geese were still going. All 14 of them. Same direction, same rhythm. Something was moving along the north edge of the farm, and it was moving toward the section where nearly 6 acres of elderberries were less than 2 weeks from harvest. He climbed into his pickup and drove without turning on the radio. To understand why a 62-year-old man in Fairgrove County, Missouri was tearing across his own gravel drive at 1:47 in the morning to listen to a flock of geese, you have to go back. Not to the summer this happened, further, all the way back to the year Rowan Trask first put a spade into the ground of a field his father Ellis had cursed for 30 years and made the decision that would eventually cost him almost everything he owned before he gave any of it back. Rowan had been born on this farm, not in a hospital. In the front bedroom of the same house he still slept in on a February night so cold his mother later said the water in the wash basin froze between the doctor's arrival and his first cry. His father Ellis had been 38 years old that winter, already old for a first child, already worn down by 2 decades of trying to make a living off ground that had never really wanted to give one. His grandfather had raised cattle on the same land. His great-grandfather had grown corn where the elderberries now stood. 3 generations of Trask men had worked these acres. Each one had in his own way discovered that Fairgrove County did not owe any farmer a good living no matter how hard he worked. Rowan had learned that early. He had learned it watching his father come in from the fields at dusk with the particular exhaustion of a man who knew his day's labor might not have been worth the fuel it took to run the tractor. He had learned it standing at the kitchen counter beside his mother while she stretched a Sunday roast into 3 weeknight meals without ever once complaining about it. He had learned it most of all in the winter. He was 14 when Ellis had sat him down at the kitchen table with a stack of unpaid feed bills and said quietly, "Son, this farm is going to test you. If you stay on it, you had better learn the difference between what you can control and what you can't." Most farmers never learn that difference. Most farmers die still trying to fight the land instead of listening to it. Rowan had not fully understood that lesson at 14. He would spend the next 48 years learning it one crop at a time. He had done a little of everything in those years. He had run cattle for his father until Ellis finally sold the last of the herd in the middle 1980s. He had grown corn and soybeans through the long stretch of thin margins that followed. He had watched neighbors sell out to bigger operations, seen family farms consolidated into corporate ground, worked by strangers on contract. He had married Isolde Valerie in the summer of 1984, a school teacher from 2 counties over who had understood from the first supper she ate at his mother's table exactly what she was marrying into. They had raised 1 daughter, Delphine. Smart, sharp-tongued, the kind of child who read at the kitchen table with her fingers stopped up in her ears against the noise of the farm. She had gone to college on scholarship. She had studied architecture. She had moved to St. Louis at 23 and had come home for holidays ever since, and every visit had ended with the same quiet, familiar conversation she had been trying to have with her father since her early 20s. "Sell it, Dad. Take the money. Retire on it. This land has taken enough from you already." Rowan had never answered her, not really. He had only nodded and refilled her coffee and let the conversation die the way it always did because he did not know how to explain to a daughter who had grown up watching him lose sleep over feed bills that this ground was not just work to him. It was the last thing his father Ellis had left him, and Rowan had spent his entire adult life trying to prove that Ellis had been right to leave it. Ellis had passed 9 years earlier, 91 years old. He had died on a Tuesday afternoon in October in the same front bedroom where Rowan had been born, with his one good hand wrapped around Rowan's own, and the last words he had spoken had been something Rowan had never quite been able to make sense of. "The old notebook, son. Look in the old notebook. I meant to tell you. I meant to." He had passed before he finished the sentence. Rowan had searched that first grieving winter. He had gone through every drawer in Ellis's old bedroom, every cabinet in the equipment shed, every rusted toolbox in the barn. He had found no notebook. He had eventually decided his father had been lost in the fog of his final hours, remembering something that had not existed or that had been lost long before either of them thought to look for it. Rowan had let it go the way a man learns to let go of most things his parents leave unfinished because there is not any other choice. The elderberries had come 3 years after Ellis passed. Rowan had turned 59 that spring. He had been sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee gone cold in his hand, staring at another year of thin corn margins on a printed page when Isolde had put a magazine down in front of him and pointed to an article circled in blue ink. "Read that." He had read it. Slowly, the article was about American elderberry, about growers in Missouri turning marginal ground into specialty crops, about small processing companies paying premium prices for cultivated berries used in syrups, teas, extracts, jams, about a market that was expanding faster than the supply could meet, and about farmers on 12 or 15 acres making more per acre than most row crop operations made on hundreds. He had looked up at Isolde. She had been watching him with the particular steadiness she reserved for the moments she already knew what he was going to decide. 12 acres, he had said. 12 acres, she had agreed. That had been how it started. He had spent 2 years researching before he planted a single row. He had visited growers in 3 states. He had learned which varieties handled Missouri weather. He had studied pruning, irrigation soil, drainage disease, pressure harvest timing, and processing requirements. He had converted a section of the old cattle pasture on the north side of the property because elderberries wanted the low, moist ground where his father had never been able to grow anything else profitably. He had put in the first plants at 59 years old, knowing full well that a new orchard would not turn a real profit until he was closing in on 63. His neighbors had been polite about it. At first, they would slow their trucks down near the fence line and ask the same questions in the same tone. "You really think people are going to pay for those little berries? What's wrong with corn? Can you even harvest something like that with a machine?" Rowan had given them all the same answer. "We'll find out." By the 4th year, he had found out. The elderberries produced. A small processing company out of Springfield bought nearly everything he could grow. A local food business began ordering frozen berries by the pallet. The farm was not making him rich. Nothing was going to make him rich at his age, on ground his father had cursed. But it was profitable, and more importantly, it had room to grow. For the first time in Rowan Trask's life, he could sit at his father's old kitchen table and look at a printed sheet of numbers and feel something that was not quite pride, but that was closer to pride than anything the land had ever given him. That was when the losses started. The first year it had been small. A few broken branches, missing fruit near the edge of the north field, tracks in the soft ground after rain. He had assumed deer. He had added fencing around the most exposed sections. He had figured that would be the end of it. The next year they had come in from the creek side. He had extended the fence. Then they had entered from the south. He had installed motion lights. The deer had gotten used to the motion lights within a season. He had installed trail cameras. The cameras had worked perfectly. Every morning, Rowan could sit at his kitchen table with his coffee and watch clear, time-stamped video of animals eating his berries 6 hours earlier. The equipment showed him exactly what had happened. It just never stopped anything. Some nights deer moved through the rows. Other nights raccoons climbed the low sections of fence. Once a group of wild turkeys had spent nearly 20 minutes scratching mulch away from the base of a block of newly planted saplings, and by the time Rowan had seen the video the next morning, the damage was already done. Not every animal caused major loss, but the farm had reached the size where small problems added up. One broken branch was nothing. 50 broken branches mattered. A few missing clusters did not hurt. Losing the best fruit along an entire field edge did. And because elderberries ripened in stages, he could not simply harvest early and avoid the risk. He had to wait for the fruit to be ready. That created a window. Every summer, for about 3 weeks, the farm became a dark purple buffet, and the animals seemed to know the timing as well as Rowan did. One morning in the third summer, he had walked out at dawn and found nearly a quarter acre stripped in a single night. He had stood between the rows for a long time. He had looked at snapped branches and stripped clusters and torn netting, and he had done what men his age sometimes do when a thing they have poured their savings into fails them at the worst possible moment. He had knelt down in the wet grass between two rows, and he had put both hands on the ground, and he had breathed slowly until his chest stopped shaking. Isolde had found him there 20 minutes later. She had not said anything. She had only crouched beside him and put her hand on his shoulder and stayed there until he was ready to stand. Every system we own reacts after the problem starts, he had said, eventually more to himself than to her. I know. The cameras record. The lights flash, the fences redirect, but nothing pays attention to the whole farm in real time. Nothing sounds the alarm before the damage is already done. I know, Rowan. There has to be something. She had squeezed his shoulder once, and she had said quietly, "Then find it, because I have watched you lose too much sleep over this ground to watch you lose everything else on top of it." That had been in July. The bad night, the truly bad night, the one that would push him past the last edge of what he could absorb, would come 3 months later. October had come cold and wet that year. The elderberry rows had been cut back for winter, the last of the fruit long since sold to Springfield, the farm settling into the slow gray rhythm of a season with nothing left to defend. Rowan had been reviewing the year's numbers at the kitchen table when the storm rolled in from the west. Wind first, then rain, then near 2 in the morning, a sound he could not immediately place, a low, cracking, splintering noise that carried across the fields, even through the closed farmhouse windows. He had gone out at first light. He had found a full half-acre of elderberry rows on the north side, flattened, not damaged, not stripped, flattened. The wind had brought down a section of the old shelter belt. His father had planted, decades earlier, 3 mature trees along the fence line, and those trees had fallen directly across the north block of his most productive plantings. Rowan had stood in the wet grass looking at the wreckage for a long time. He had not knelt this time. He had not put his hands on the ground. He had only stood there and let the cold October rain run down the back of his coat and calculated in the flat mechanical way farmers learn to calculate loss, exactly how much this was going to cost him. 60% of that block's yield, 2 years minimum before replacement plantings would produce. He had gone into the house. Isolde had already been up. She had one look at his face and had known. How bad? The whole north corner. The old windbreak came down. She had sat down slowly at the kitchen table. She had not asked anything else. She had only pushed the coffee pot toward him and let him pour himself a cup, and then she had sat there beside him in the particular silence of a woman who had learned 40 years into a marriage that some blows do not need commentary. The call from the bank had come 3 days later. Alden Whitmore was the loan officer at Fairgrove Farmers and Merchants, a man about 10 years younger than Rowan, careful with his words, the particular careful of a man whose job it was to deliver news he did not always personally believe in. He had asked first whether Rowan and Isolde were all right after the storm. He had said all the right things. Then he had gotten to the reason for the call, the equipment loan. Rowan had refinanced the elderberry irrigation system 4 years earlier when he had put in the drip lines and the new pump. The payments had been manageable in good years. They had been tight in the 2 most recent years as the losses from wildlife damage had eaten into margins. The storm damage was going to push the coming year from tight into something else. "Rowan," Alden had said, and Rowan had heard in the pause before the sentence continued exactly what was coming. "I want to be honest with you because I've known you a long time, and I owe you honesty. If next year's harvest doesn't come in strong, the bank is going to have to look at restructuring your note. That means new terms. That means new collateral. That means potentially a conversation about what parts of the operation the bank considers viable and what parts it doesn't." Rowan had not answered right away. He had looked out the kitchen window at the north field, where the fallen trees still lay across his best plantings, and he had made himself breathe. "How bad, Alden?" "It depends on the year. Best case, we work out an extension and you're fine. Worst case, we're looking at consolidating the note against the whole farm, not just the equipment." "I don't want to be the one to have that conversation with you, Rowan. I'm telling you this now because I want you to have time to think about your options." "My father is buried on this land, Alden." I know he is. His father is buried on this land. I know that too. Rowan had thanked him for calling. He had hung up. He had sat at the kitchen table for a long time, holding the phone in one hand and his coffee mug in the other, and he had not moved until Isolde had come in and taken the phone from him gently and set it back in its cradle. "We are not selling this land," she had said. "I know. I am not going to spend the rest of my life in a subdivision in Springfield watching some corporation strip your father's fields." "I know, Isolde." "Then we find a way through this." He had looked at her. He had nodded once. He had gone out to the barn. He had spent that winter doing what men in his position have always done. He had read. He had thought. He had walked the property in the cold morning after morning, looking at the fence lines, and the camera positions, and the motion light arrays, and he had asked himself over and over again the same question: what am I missing? The cameras recorded, the fences redirected, the lights startled. Every piece of equipment on the farm did one thing well, and none of them did the one thing he actually needed, which was to notice in real time before the damage began that something was wrong. He had been going through the equipment shed one afternoon in early December looking for a spare pump housing when he found the notebook. It had been on the top shelf behind a coffee can full of rusted nails wrapped in an oilcloth that had gone stiff with age. Small, leather-bound, barely thicker than his palm. The cover was blank, but when he opened it, the first page carried his father Ellis's handwriting, cramped and careful in pencil that had faded almost past legibility. "For my son, if he ever needs it." Rowan had sat down on an overturned bucket in that cold shed, and he had not moved for a long time. The notebook was not long, perhaps 40 pages, most of them only half filled. Notes about weather patterns, notes about which corners of the farm the deer used and which corners the coyotes preferred, and which stretches of fence had always been the hardest to keep tight. Notes about livestock, most of them dating back to the cattle years of the 1980s. And on a page near the middle, a passage that Rowan would read 3 times before he fully absorbed it. "If you ever hear them, son, listen closely. Machines only hear a thing after it has already broken. I learned that too late. Your grandfather knew it. His father knew it. I forgot, and it cost me the herd twice. If you keep livestock again, whatever kind, make sure you keep the kind that talks." Rowan had read the passage a 4th time. His hands had been shaking, just slightly. He had not fully understood in that moment exactly what his father had meant. But he had understood that Ellis, in his last conscious hours, 9 years earlier, had been trying to point him toward this notebook, toward this passage, toward this specific lesson. The old notebook, son. Look in the old notebook. I meant to tell you. He had carried the notebook into the house. He had put it on the kitchen table, and he had shown Isolde the passage. She had read it slowly. She had looked up at him. "What kind of livestock talks? I don't know yet. Are you going to find out?" He had thought about the storm, about the flattened rows, about Alden Whitmore's careful voice on the phone, about the bank and the note and the daughter in St. Louis who thought he should sell. He had thought about his father, 91 years old, dying with an unfinished sentence in his mouth. "I'm going to find out." He had spent the next 2 months reading about livestock behavior, not because he wanted another farm business. He was looking for an alarm. He had read about donkeys protecting sheep. He had read about dogs living with goat herds. He had read about guinea fowl making noise when strangers approached a barn. He had read about llamas guarding pastures in the Mountain West. He had learned in that reading that farmers had been using animals as warning systems for as long as farming had existed, and that most of that knowledge had been quietly discarded in the last 50 years, replaced by cameras and motion lights and electric fencing, which were all wonderful things, and none of which had ever saved a single crop the night it needed saving. And then in a book he had ordered used from a farm supply catalog, he had come across a chapter on geese. He had almost laughed the first time he read it. He had grown up around geese. He knew they were loud. He knew they were territorial. He knew they were stubborn and messy and difficult for anyone who expected them to behave like chickens. But the more he read, the more the idea began to make sense. Geese noticed change. They reacted to unfamiliar movement. They paid attention to the areas where they ate and rested and slept, and they defended those areas with a persistence that no camera and no fence could match. They did not need batteries. They did not lose a signal. They did not sleep through the moment when it mattered. Rowan had not been looking for animals to fight predators. He had not wanted geese chasing deer through his fields. He had wanted an early warning, something that would notice unusual movement before the damage reached the middle of the crop. He had shown the chapter to Isolde. She had read it. She had looked up at him with the particular expression she had used over 40 years to signal that she was about to be honest with him whether he wanted her to be or not. Rowan, I know. You are talking about spending money we do not have on birds to guard a crop the bank is already looking at as marginal. I know. The bank is not going to lend you money for geese. I know that too. Then what are you telling me? He had not answered right away. He had looked down at the notebook on the kitchen table, at his father's handwriting, at the pencil that had faded almost past reading. He had thought about the flattened rows. He had thought about Alden Whitmore's careful voice. He had thought about the daughter who wanted him to sell. I am telling you, he had said finally, that I have one more idea to try, and if it does not work, I will sit down with Delphine and Alden and every one of them, and I will talk about what comes next. But I have one more idea, and I would like your permission to try it. Isolde had looked at him for a long moment. She had looked at the notebook. She had looked at her husband, 62 years old, gray at the temples now, with hands that had worked this ground for 48 years, and had never once found a shortcut worth taking. How much would you need? 1,200 for 20 birds. Fencing and shelter, maybe another 800. You do not have $2,000, Rowan. I have the old International Harvester in the back shed. It has not turned over in 6 years. Merle Hadley's boy has been asking about it. He will pay $2,000 for it cash if I let it go this week. That was your father's tractor. I know it was. She had looked at him a long time. Then sell it, she had said, and go find your birds. He had gone into town the next morning. The feed store at the corner of Route 63 and Old Mill Road had been Rowan's stop every Saturday of his adult life. Thurman Odell had run the place for the last 22 years, a man about Rowan's age, quick with a joke, quicker with an opinion he had not been asked for. Rowan had stopped in for a bag of layer feed and, without particularly meaning to, had mentioned to Thurman what he was thinking about doing. Thurman had laughed, loud enough that 2 other men at the counter had turned around. Geese, geese, you are going to guard elderberries with geese. I am going to see if they notice trouble before I do. They'll notice the mailman Rowan, they'll notice your truck, they'll notice clouds. Then I'll have to learn what they're saying. One of the men at the counter had chimed in. Rowan had recognized him as Barnett Sheffield, president of the County Farm Bureau, a man about 7 years younger than Rowan, well-dressed even in a feed store, with the particular smile of a man who enjoyed the sound of his own words being repeated. Rowan Trask, Sheffield had said, warm on the surface, cold underneath, in a way Rowan had learned to recognize over decades. First man in Fairgrove County to guard a berry patch with poultry. That's going to be a story. Might be, Rowan had said. Your daddy would have appreciated the entertainment. That had been the moment Rowan understood very clearly that whatever was coming next was not just going to be about the birds. Because Barnett Sheffield was not just any neighbor. Barnett Sheffield was the son of Corliss Sheffield, who had run for County Farm Bureau president against Ellis Trask in 1984 and had lost by 14 votes and had never in the 4 decades since entirely forgiven the Trask family for that loss. Ellis had held the seat for 6 years before stepping down. Corliss had never held it. His son Barnett now held the seat his father had wanted and had held it for the last 11 years and had built a small, careful reputation as a man who did not tolerate what he called irresponsible farming practices in Fairgrove County. Rowan had not thought about the Sheffields in years, but he had in that moment, standing at the counter of Thurman Odell's feed store with a bag of layer pellets in his hand, understood exactly what Barnett Sheffield's smile meant. He had paid for his feed. He had said goodbye to Thurman. He had walked out to his truck. He had driven home the long way past the north field, where the fallen trees still lay across the flattened rows, past the fence line his father had built in 1968, past the pasture where the old International Harvester tractor was going to be picked up in 3 days by Merle Hadley's boy for $2,000 in cash. At the end of that week, he had driven to a breeder 2 counties north. He had come back with 20 young geese in the bed of his pickup. He had turned them loose into 4 small enclosures he had built along the perimeter of the elderberry fields, one near the creek, one near the north tree line where the storm had come through, one near the south entrance where the outer fence crossed an old cattle trail, one near the equipment road and packing shed. Isolde had stood on the porch and watched him from a distance while he set them up. She had not come down. She had waited until he was walking back toward the house at dusk, and then she had come down the porch steps and met him halfway, and she had put her hand on his forearm, and she had said quietly, "I hope your father knew what he was talking about, Rowan." He had looked out toward the fields. The geese, all 20 of them, were quiet, standing near their new water troughs, watching him watch them. So do I. That had been in March. By the time August came, and the elderberries began to purple and the animals outside the farm began to pay attention, Rowan Trask would have already lost more sleep, spent more money, and endured more public mockery than he had at any point in his 62 years of working this land. He would have already stood in a courtroom he had not expected to enter. He would have already watched the man his father had beaten in 1984 try to take from him the last thing he owned. He would have already come within one bad decision of walking away from all of it. But that was still to come. For now, on a cold March evening in Fairgrove County, Missouri, a 62-year-old farmer stood at the edge of his own Northfield watching 20 young birds settle into a life he had built for them with the last $2,000 he could put his hands on. And beside him stood the woman who had chosen 40 years earlier to marry into this ground. Neither of them said anything else. The wind moved through the elderberry rows behind them. Somewhere in the distance, one of the geese honked, once low and unhurried, and the sound carried across the empty field like a question that had not yet been answered. Rowan Trask thought about his father. The old notebook, son. Look in the old notebook. He thought about the passage, "Machines only hear a thing after it is already broken." He thought about Barnett Sheffield's smile in the feed store, and about Alden Whitmore's careful voice on the phone, and about the daughter in St. Louis who thought he should sell, and about the 14 votes in 1984 that had apparently never fully finished being counted. He looked at the birds one more time. Then he turned and he walked with his wife back up the gravel drive toward the house, and the light in the kitchen was already on, waiting for them the way it had been waiting for him every night of his adult life on this farm. Behind them, the geese settled into their first evening on Trask land. None of them knew yet what they were about to be asked to do. Neither did he. The first 3 weeks of April taught Rowan Trask exactly how little he understood about the animals he had brought onto his land. The geese reacted to everything. A truck slowing on the county road half a mile away. A crow landing on the wrong fence post. A plastic feed sack blowing across the yard on a windy afternoon. A hawk circling too low over the tree line, the mail carrier's brake lights. His own daughter's rental car when she pulled into the drive for a surprise visit in the second week of April, an event that produced enough sustained honking from 3 separate enclosures that Delphine, 20 minutes into her stay, had asked her father with the particular careful tone of a grown daughter about to say something she had been rehearsing in the car for the last 2 hours, whether he'd considered speaking to someone about the choices he had been making lately. Rowan had poured her a cup of coffee. He had listened to her while she talked. He had waited until she had finished, and then he had said quietly, "I know you love me, Delphine, and I know you think this is a mistake, but I am asking you to give it until harvest. That is all I am asking. If it does not work by August, I will sit down with you and your mother and Alden Whitmore, and we will talk about whatever comes next." She had looked at him for a long moment. She was 35 years old. She had her mother's dark hair gone through in 2 places with early silver already, and she had her father's stubborn mouth, and she had spent the last decade designing office buildings for developers in St. Louis who would never once in their lives stand in a wet field at dawn looking at a broken fence. Until August, Dad. Until August. She had left the next morning. She had hugged her mother on the porch. She had hugged her father the way she had hugged him since she was 8 years old, quick and firm and not looking at his face because she had never been able to hold his gaze while doing it. She had driven back to St. Louis. She had not called for 6 weeks. Rowan had gone back out to the fields. He carried a notebook everywhere he went, not his father's notebook. His father's notebook stayed in a drawer beside the bed, wrapped again in its oilcloth, brought out only in the evenings when Rowan wanted to read the middle passage one more time before sleeping. This new notebook was cheap, spiral-bound, the kind of thing Isolde used for grocery lists, and Rowan carried it in his jacket pocket, and every time the geese sounded off, he wrote down the time walked to the nearest camera position and reviewed what the camera had captured. Truck at 8:12 in the morning, feed delivery, full flock reaction, dog near the south fence at 10:47, neighbor's beagle, south flock sustained, wild turkey near the creek at 6:05, creek flock brief then settled, Wind pushing an empty feed bag across the equipment yard at 3:20 in the afternoon. Every flock, loud. Airplane at 11:02. Crop duster 2 counties east. Every flock 30 seconds sustained. The airplane one had been embarrassing. Thurman Odell had called 10 minutes after the airplane passed, and Rowan had known even before he answered exactly what Thurman was going to say. "Rowan, you under attack?" "No." "Then why can I hear your birds from my machine shed?" "Airplane." There had been a long pause on the line. Rowan had heard Thurman shift the phone against his ear. "Your security team needs training." "So do I." Thurman had hung up laughing. Rowan had stood in the kitchen looking out the window at the north flock, which was still 3 full minutes after the airplane had passed, honking at a sky that no longer contained anything worth honking at. He had told Isolde about it at dinner. She had listened. She had cut her pot roast into small, careful pieces. She had said without looking up, "The problem is not the geese, Rowan. I know. You do not know the difference yet between what they are telling you. I know. You will have to learn it. I am trying." She had looked up then. She had reached across the table and put her hand on his wrist briefly, the way she did when she wanted to say something without saying it. Then she had gone back to her pot roast. He had spent the following 2 weeks doing exactly what she had told him he needed to do. He had learned the difference. The geese had different voices. He had not understood that at first. He had thought a honk was a honk, but the more time he spent listening, the more he began to hear it. When the feed truck came up the drive, the birds sounded off in scattered, unhurried bursts. Some kept eating. Some walked toward the road. Their calls were irritated but loose. They were saying in the only language they had, "Someone is here who does not belong here, but I am not afraid." When a dog appeared along the fence line, the calls tightened. The flock grouped. Necks went up. Every bird looked in the same direction. The rhythm became faster, more even, and it did not stop until whatever they were watching had moved out of sight. When something moved along the tree line after dark, the calls came in the sharp bursts he had heard for the first time on the night he had bought them when a stray cat had crossed the equipment yard at 9:30 in the evening. That was the sound that meant, "We do not know what this is, and we do not like it." He wrote all of it down, every reaction, every camera cross-reference, every context. By the end of April, he could tell without leaving the kitchen from the sound of the honking alone roughly what kind of thing his geese were reacting to. Isolde could tell faster. She had, without either of them quite noticing when it happened, become better at reading the birds than he was. She could stand at the kitchen sink washing a pan and listen for 3 seconds to a burst of sound from the creek flock and say without turning around, "That is a raccoon. He is on the north side of the water. He is by himself." And she would be right every time. Rowan would drive out with his flashlight and confirm the raccoon and come back to the kitchen, and she would already be back at the sink washing the pan. He had asked her one evening in the second week of May how she was doing it. She had thought about it a long time before she answered. When Delphine was a baby, she had said, "I used to know from the sound of one cough in the middle of the night whether she had a cold coming or whether she had swallowed something or whether she was just dreaming. I never taught myself to do that. I just paid attention long enough until I could hear it. You are telling me the geese are our baby." "I am telling you," she had said, "that a woman who has raised a child knows how to listen to something that cannot speak, and that this is not a skill men your age were ever taught, and that I am going to have to teach you." He had not answered. He had gone to the porch after supper. He had sat there a long time in the fading light. He had thought about 40 years of marriage and about how many things his wife had learned in that time that he had never noticed her learning, and about how much of what he had built on this farm existed only because Isolde Valerie Trask had chosen in 1984 to marry a man whose father had just won a Farm Bureau election by 14 votes. He had gone inside eventually. He had not said anything about it. He had from that evening forward listened to his wife when she told him what the birds were saying, every single time. The complaint arrived in the mail on a Tuesday in late May. It came in a plain white envelope with a Fairgrove County return address, and it was addressed to Rowan Trask, and Isolde brought it into the kitchen with the rest of the day's mail and set it on the table without opening it, because she had already read the postmark, and she already knew somehow that this was going to be the beginning of something. Rowan opened it after supper. He read it once. He read it again. He set it down on the kitchen table, and he looked at Isolde, and Isolde looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a long time. The complaint was a formal noise ordinance filing. It had been submitted according to the letterhead by an anonymous neighbor of the Trask farm. who had grown concerned about the sustained and disruptive nocturnal disturbances originating from the property, and who was requesting that the County Farm Bureau conduct a formal review of the property's compliance with local agricultural noise standards. The letter was signed by Barnett Sheffield, president of the Fairgrove County Farm Bureau, on behalf of the complainant, and it invited Rowan to attend a public hearing in 21 days, at which time the Bureau would determine whether further action was warranted. Isolde had picked the letter up. She had read it. She had put it down again slowly, and she had said without any heat in her voice at all, "That is not an anonymous neighbor. No, that is Barnett Sheffield. Yes. He waited a long time for this. 20 years. She had gone to the sink. She had turned the water on. She had turned it off. She had come back to the table. What do we do?" Rowan had looked at his hands. He had thought about the tractor he had sold. He had thought about the notebook in the drawer beside the bed. He had thought about Delphine 6 weeks out from her August deadline. He had thought about Alden Whitmore's careful voice on the phone. He had thought about his father dying with an unfinished sentence in his mouth, and about the 14 votes in 1984 that had never really finished being counted. "We go to the hearing," he had said, "and we tell them what the birds are doing, and we let them decide." Rowan. What? Barnett Sheffield is not going to decide fairly. I know. He has been waiting for a reason. I know that too. Then what are we doing? He had looked at her. He had reached across the table and taken her hand. He had held it for a long moment. "We are doing what my father did," he had said. "We are showing up, and we are telling the truth, and we are letting people decide what they want to do with it." Isolde had not answered. She had squeezed his hand once. Then she had gotten up, and she had cleared the dishes, and she had gone upstairs, and Rowan had heard her 20 minutes later on the phone to their daughter in St. Louis, telling her what had happened in the calm, unhurried voice of a woman who had never once in her 40-year marriage let her husband go into a fight without making sure he had at least one person besides herself standing behind him. Delphine had driven down that Friday. She had brought her laptop. She had brought a folder of noise ordinance research she had pulled from the county code overnight. She had brought a designer's eye that Rowan had never fully appreciated until she spent Saturday walking his 4 goose enclosures with a notebook and a laser distance measure. By Sunday afternoon, she had drawn him a new layout. She had done it on the kitchen table on graph paper in the same careful, precise handwriting she had used since she was 10 years old. She had moved the creek flock further from the brush, cut back the low branches that had been triggering false alarms every time the wind moved through them, and placed a visual barrier of stacked hay bales along one side of the enclosure so the birds focused their attention on the open crossing instead of every rustle in the leaves. She had moved the south flock deeper onto the property further from the county road so passing drivers stopped triggering it. She had rebuilt the equipment road group's shelter with a solid 3-sided wall facing the road, which she explained in a way that Rowan only half understood, but Isolde apparently understood completely, would reduce the birds' visual field to only the things that actually mattered to them. She had left the north flock alone. "The north flock is fine, Dad," she had said. "The north flock is exactly where it needs to be. If something comes through this farm from the north, that flock is going to hear it before anything else on this property hears it." She had rolled up her drawings. She had put them in a tube. She had handed them to her father. "Do not tell your mother I helped you," she had said, "because if you tell her I helped you, she is going to think I am changing my mind. And I am not changing my mind, Dad. I still think you should sell. I still think this is going to kill you. But you asked me for until August, and I gave you until August, and I am going to make sure that until August you have every reasonable chance I know how to give you." She had hugged him. She had driven back to St. Louis. Isolde had come out onto the porch after her taillights disappeared. She had stood beside her husband a long moment. "She helped you," she had said. "She did. She is going to change her mind. I hope so. She already has, Rowan. She just does not know it yet." The rebuild took the better part of a week. Rowan and one of the neighbor's boys, a 19-year-old named Corbin, who worked hourly for anyone in the county who would pay him, moved the fencing, hauled the hay bales, cut back the creek brush, rebuilt the shelter walls. The geese, who had spent 2 months settling into their original enclosures, spent 3 days in a state of loud, sustained protest that Rowan was almost grateful for because it gave him one final opportunity to test the difference between complaint and alarm before the birds settled into the new layout. By the end of that week, the false alarms had dropped by more than half. By the end of the following week, they had dropped by nearly three-quarters. The birds were still noisy. They were still going to be noisy. That was, Rowan had come to understand, not a bug. It was the entire feature. But the noise now meant something more often than it did not, and Isolde could stand at the kitchen sink and identify within seconds which flock was reacting and to what. And Rowan had, at some point during that week, without quite noticing when it happened, stopped writing every event down in the notebook because he had learned to hear it himself. The birds had a language. They had taught it to him, and he had begun finally to understand what his father Ellis had meant. Then the storms came. The last week of June brought 3 consecutive nights of thunderstorms rolling in from the west, the kind of Missouri weather that pushed wind through the elderberry rows in long, uneven gusts and set every loose thing on the farm creaking and shifting and slapping against something else. The geese reacted every night, all 4 flocks. Sustained sharp, alarm-sounding calls that woke Rowan out of a dead sleep at 11:40 on Sunday, at 1:15 on Monday, and at 2:30 on Tuesday. Each night he had driven out. Each night he had found nothing. Loose branches moving in the wind. A section of tarp on the packing shed roof that had come partway free. A feed sack he had forgotten to weight down. Nothing that mattered. Nothing that justified the sustained noise. Nothing that justified 3 nights running a man his age, climbing out of bed and driving across his own farm in the rain to confirm what he already suspected the moment he heard the sound. On the 4th night, the geese sounded off again. It was Wednesday. It was 4 in the morning. Rowan had been asleep for less than 2 hours, having spent the previous evening on the phone with the county clerk's office, trying to understand the procedural requirements for the noise ordinance hearing, which was now 9 days away. He had heard the geese start. He had recognized in the fog of half-sleep the sharp, urgent tone of the north flock. He had reached for his boots. Then he had stopped. He had lain there in the dark, listening. He had thought about the last 3 nights. He had thought about the tarp and the feed sack and the branches. He had thought about how tired he was. He had thought about how much money he did not have and how much sleep he did not have and how much of both of those things he had already spent on birds that reacted to everything and had so far prevented nothing. He had told himself in the flat, exhausted voice a man uses when he is about to make a mistake he already knows is a mistake, that the birds were reacting to the wind. Again. That it was nothing. Again. That he could check it at first light. He had rolled over. He had gone back to sleep. At 6:15 in the morning, he had walked out to the north field, and he had found what a warning system that had been ignored the one time it truly mattered had cost him. The raccoons had come through in numbers. Not 1, not 2, 6 of them at least, judging by the tracks in the wet mud between the rows. They had come in through a section of fence the storms had loosened, and they had spent the better part of 2 hours in the north block of the elderberry orchard. And they had done what raccoons do to fruit that is very nearly ripe and completely undefended. 30 plants damaged, 16 of them severely. The kind of damage that meant in the flat calculation farmers do without meaning to another 6 or 7% shaved off the North Block's harvests. On top of everything else. 9 days before a county farm bureau hearing at which Barnett Sheffield was going to argue that the birds were causing more disruption than value. Rowan had stood in the wet grass for a long time. He had not knelt. He had not sat down. He had only stood there and looked at the damage and understood with the kind of clarity that only comes to a man alone in a field at dawn after a mistake that cannot be taken back, that the birds had done exactly what he had brought them onto this farm to do. And that he had failed them, not the other way around. He had walked back to the house. Isolde had been in the kitchen. She had one look at his face. How bad? 30 plants, 16 serious. Raccoons. 6 of them at least. The north fence loosened in Monday's storm. They came through there. She had closed her eyes for a long moment. You did not go out last night. No. You heard them. I heard them. You thought it was the wind. I thought it was the wind. She had not said anything else. She had turned back to the stove. She had cracked 2 eggs into a pan. Rowan had gone into the front room. He had sat down in his father's old chair. He had put his head in his hands. He had thought for the first time since March about what it would look like to sell, about what Alden Whitmore had said. about Barnett Sheffield's smile in the feed store, about Delphine's face, 35 years old, on the porch, telling him she still thought this was going to kill him. He had sat there a long time. He had thought about walking away. Isolde had come in eventually. She had set a plate of eggs and toast on the small table beside his chair. She had not said anything. She had gone back to the kitchen. He had eaten the eggs. He had finished the coffee. He had gone out to the barn. He had spent that day repairing the fence the raccoons had come through. He had spent the following day rebuilding the low section along the drainage where the deer had come through the previous summer. He had spent the day after that walking the entire perimeter of the elderberry fields with a fresh spool of wire and a pair of tension pliers, and he had thought the whole time about the difference between an alarm system that fails and a man who fails his alarm system. The geese had done their job. He had failed to do his. On the evening of the third day after the raccoon damage, Isolde had come out to the barn where he was cleaning the tension pliers. "Rowan, I know. You are going into the hearing next week." "I am." "You are going to walk in there and tell them what happened." "I am." "You are going to tell them that the birds did their job and you did not." He had looked up from the pliers. "Yes," he had said. "I am." "Barnett Sheffield is going to try to use that against you. He is. He is going to say that even you admit the system does not work. He is." She had crossed her arms. She had looked at him for a long moment. She had said without any heat in the particular voice she used when she was about to tell him something he needed to hear, "Then you are going to have to be a better witness than he is a prosecutor. And I do not know if you can do that, Rowan. I have never seen you do that. But I am telling you now that it is what next Thursday is going to ask of you." He had put the pliers down. He had looked at his wife of 40 years. "Then I'm going to have to learn," he had said. Between now and Thursday. Delphine had come down again that Sunday. She had not been asked to. She had simply arrived at 3 in the afternoon with a suitcase and a folder, and the particular set of her shoulders that Rowan had recognized from her childhood as the signal that she had made a decision and had not yet decided how much of it to explain. She had come into the kitchen. She had put the folder on the table. "I called my firm," she had said. "I took the week off. I am staying until after the hearing." Isolde had looked at her. "You do not have to do that, honey." "I know I do not have to." "Delphine, I know, Mom." She had looked at her father. "I still think you should sell, Dad. I still think this is going to kill you. But I am not going to let Barnett Sheffield take it from you before you get the chance to decide that for yourself." Rowan had not been able to speak for a long moment. He had reached across the table. He had put his hand over his daughter's. He had said very quietly, "Thank you, Delphine." She had squeezed his hand once, then she had opened the folder, and she had pulled out 3 days of research on Missouri agricultural noise ordinances, and she had begun on the kitchen table where she had once done her 6th grade homework to walk her father through exactly what he was going to need to know before he stepped into the Fairgrove County Farm Bureau hearing room on Thursday morning. Isolde had made coffee. Outside in the late June afternoon light, the 4 flocks of geese moved through their enclosures at the quiet, unhurried pace they had settled into since Delphine's rebuild in early June. The birds had, in the week since the raccoon damage, sounded exactly 2 alarms. Both had been real. One had turned out to be a stray dog on the equipment road. The other had been a coyote crossing the South Trail at dusk. Rowan had gone out both times. He had gone out inside of 90 seconds both times. Neither incursion had made it into the fields. He had, since the night he had rolled over and gone back to sleep, not once ignored his birds. He had not planned to ignore them ever again, and he had begun to suspect, though he had not yet said it aloud, that the difference between a farmer who lost his ground and a farmer who kept it was in the end not much more complicated than the difference between a man who listened when he was warned and a man who did not. The hearing was in 4 days. Barnett Sheffield had already sent the previous Friday a supplemental filing to the County Farm Bureau requesting that the hearing be moved to the larger meeting room on the grounds that public interest in the case had grown substantially in the last 2 weeks. That was, Rowan had understood immediately, not a request. That was an announcement. Sheffield was expecting a crowd. Sheffield had spent the last 2 weeks making sure there would be one. Winona Lark had called on Monday. She was 28 years old. She was a reporter for the Fairgrove County Herald, and she had been writing agricultural features for the paper since her 2nd year out of journalism school. And she had heard about the hearing from a source at the courthouse, and she had wanted, she said, to come out and interview Rowan before Thursday, just to get his side, just so the paper had it in case the hearing did not give him the chance to say it all himself. Rowan had told her no. He had told her politely that he did not want anything printed before the hearing that Barnett Sheffield could use as a weapon against him inside it. He had told her if she wanted to come out afterward, whatever the outcome was, he would sit down with her then, not before. She had understood. She had thanked him for his time. She had said before she hung up, "Mr. Trask, for what it's worth, my grandfather was a dairy farmer near Ozark. He used to say the same thing your father wrote in that notebook of his." Rowan had gone very still, which was that machines only hear a thing after it is already broken. He had not been able to answer for a moment. "How did you know about the notebook?" There had been a pause. Then Winona Lark had said carefully, "Your daughter called me on Friday. She said if I was going to write about her father, she wanted me to know who her father actually was." Rowan had thanked her. He had hung up. He had gone to find Delphine. She had been out at the north flock, standing at the fence with her mother, listening to the birds move quietly through the enclosure in the late afternoon light. She had not turned around when he approached. She had known somehow that he was coming, and she had known somehow exactly what he was coming to say. He had stood beside her a long moment. "You called the reporter." "I did." "You told her about the notebook." "I did." "Why?" Delphine had looked out across the elderberry rows at the geese at the fence line her grandfather Ellis had built in 1968 and her father had rebuilt in 1992. "Because Barnett Sheffield is going to walk into that room on Thursday, Dad, and he is going to try to convince a room full of people who have known you your whole life that you are a foolish old man with a broken idea. And I want at least one person in that room to know before he opens his mouth that this was Grandpa Ellis's idea before it was yours, and that you have been trying this whole year to finish a sentence he never got to finish." Rowan had not answered. He had put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. The three of them had stood there together, husband and wife and grown daughter, watching the north flock in the fading light, and none of them had said anything else for a long time. The hearing was in 3 days. The geese in the enclosure behind them moved through the tall June grass with the slow, deliberate rhythm of birds that had been listening all summer to a farm that had finally at last begun listening back. The morning of the hearing came clear and cool, the kind of Missouri June day that felt more like early September, with a wind moving through the elderberry rows that carried the first faint smell of ripening fruit still weeks away from harvest. Rowan Trask sat on the porch at 5:30 in the morning with a cup of coffee and his father's notebook open on his knee. He had read the middle passage 16 times over the past week. He knew it by heart. He read it once more that morning in the pale light before the sun had properly come up over the tree line. And he closed the notebook and he wrapped it in the oilcloth and he set it beside him on the porch railing. And he watched the north flock move through the tall grass beyond the barn with the slow, unhurried patience of birds that had settled finally into a farm they knew. Isolde came out at 6. She was already dressed, not in her Sunday clothes, in the practical plain blouse and slacks she wore to any event she considered serious enough to require thought about what to wear, and not so serious that she wanted to look like she had spent thought about what to wear. She sat down beside him on the porch. She did not say anything for a long time. Eventually, she said, "You are going to be all right, Rowan. I hope so. You are going to be all right whether you win in there or not. I know. I want you to hear me say that before you go in, because Barnett Sheffield is going to try to make you feel like the whole world ends in that room today, and it does not. I need you to know that it does not. Whatever happens in there, we still have this porch, and we still have each other, and we still have your father's ground under our feet. That does not go away because a farm bureau votes on a noise ordinance." He had reached over and taken her hand. He had held it a long moment. "I hear you," he had said. Delphine had come out at 6:15 in a charcoal suit Rowan had never seen his daughter wear on the farm in her entire adult life, with the folder of noise ordinance research in one hand and her mother's second cup of coffee in the other, and the three of them had sat on the porch together as the sun came up over the tree line, and none of them had said anything else for a while. Then Rowan had stood, and he had gone inside to shave, and by 7:30 he was in his truck with Isolde beside him and Delphine following in her rental car, and the three of them had driven the 11 miles into town to the Fairgrove County Farm Bureau building, where a hearing was going to decide in the flat, unhurried way that bureaucratic proceedings decide such things, whether Rowan Trask would be permitted to keep the birds his father had in a notebook 40 years old told him to buy, The room was full when they arrived, not standing room full, but full enough that Rowan understood, walking in behind his wife and daughter, exactly what Barnett Sheffield had been doing for the last 2 weeks. There were 40-some people in that room, and Rowan recognized most of them, and none of them had ever come to a Farm Bureau hearing in the 22 years he had been paying dues to this organization. Thurman Odell was there. He was sitting near the back. Merle Hadley was there. His son, the boy who had bought the old International Harvester tractor for $2,000 in cash, was sitting beside him. Perry Caldwell was there. He was sitting in the middle row alone with his hat in his lap. Rowan had not spoken to Perry Caldwell in 6 months, since the previous December, when Perry's fence had come down in a storm, and Rowan had helped him get his cattle back into the pasture. Perry had thanked him at the time. Perry had not called him since. That was the way of things in Fairgrove County. You did not need frequent contact to know that a man would show up when he needed to. Winona Lark was there. She was sitting in the front row on the far side with a small notebook open on her knee and a pen in her hand, and the particular composed patience of a young reporter who understood even at 28 that the best thing she could do at a hearing like this one was watch and take notes and let the room show her what it was going to show her. Alden Whitmore was there. That surprised Rowan. Alden was sitting near the aisle in a gray suit with his own folder closed on his lap, and when Rowan met his eyes across the room, Alden had nodded once without smiling, and Rowan had nodded back without smiling, and neither of them had needed to say anything. Barnett Sheffield was at the front of the room at the raised bureau bench in a navy blazer with a bureau pin on his lapel, going through papers with the practiced ease of a man who had presided over hundreds of hearings in this room, and had apparently been looking forward to this one for longer than most people would have believed. He looked up when Rowan came in. He smiled. It was the same smile he had used in the feed store 4 months earlier, warm on the surface, cold underneath. And Rowan understood in the moment their eyes met across that room that whatever was going to happen next had already been decided in Barnett Sheffield's mind long before either of them had walked in. He sat down beside Isolde in the second row. Delphine sat down on his other side. The hearing began at 8. Barnett Sheffield read the complaint aloud. He read it in the flat official voice of a man performing procedure, but the words themselves had been written with more care than procedure required, and Rowan could hear underneath the officialness the particular pleasure of a man who had waited a long time to read them aloud. Sustained and disruptive nocturnal disturbances. Unregulated poultry operation exceeding customary agricultural use. Complaints from multiple neighbors regarding sleep interference and quality of life. The complaint had never named those neighbors. Sheffield had, in his introductory remarks, invited any of them to come forward and speak. No one came forward. Rowan watched him. He watched Sheffield glance briefly toward the back of the room as though expecting someone specific to stand. He watched no one stand. He watched Sheffield's smile tighten just slightly and then resume and then continue with the reading. Delphine beside him wrote something in her notebook. Sheffield finished the complaint. He set it down. He turned to Rowan. "Mr. Trask, this bureau invites you to respond." Rowan stood. He had not written a speech. Delphine had offered to write him one. Isolde had offered to help him write one. He had told them both quietly on Tuesday night that he did not want to read from a paper in that room. He wanted to say what he had come to say the way his father would have said it, which was slowly in his own words without notes. He looked at Barnett Sheffield. He looked at the room. He said, "My father, Ellis Trask, farmed the ground my geese are standing on today for 53 years. He passed 9 years ago. His last words to me before he passed were about a notebook he had left in the equipment shed. It took me 9 years to find that notebook. When I did in December of last year, I found a passage in the middle of it that told me my father had lost his cattle herd twice in the 1980s because he did not have anything on the farm that could warn him when something was wrong. He wrote that machines only hear a thing after it is already broken. He wrote that if I ever kept livestock again, I should keep the kind that talks. I bought 20 geese in March of this year with the last $2,000 I could put my hands on. I bought them because I had lost half an acre of elderberry to a storm last October and could not afford to lose any more. I bought them because my father 40 years ago told me to. And they have done, in the 4 months since I bought them, exactly what my father said they would do." He paused. The room was quiet. He looked at Barnett Sheffield. 2 weeks ago, he said, "The birds sounded an alarm at 4 in the morning during a storm. I had been woken by them 3 nights in a row, and each time it had been the wind. On the fourth night, I ignored them, and I went back to sleep, and 6 raccoons came through a fence the storm had loosened and did enough damage to 16 of my plants to shave another 6% off this year's North Block harvest. That was my failure, not the birds. The birds did their job. I did not do mine. I have not ignored them since. I do not intend to ignore them again. He looked at the room. I understand this hearing has been called to determine whether my birds are creating a public disturbance. I would ask the Bureau to consider that in the 11 weeks since I moved the flock enclosures to their current locations, my geese have sounded exactly 17 alarms. 15 of them have been correctly identified by my wife Isolde within 30 seconds of the first call. 2 of them were misidentified. Both misidentifications happened before June. Since then, the birds have been accurate every single time. This is not a poultry operation. This is not livestock in any commercial sense. These are 20 animals doing what my father Ellis knew geese have always done, which is notice what people do not notice and warn about it before it becomes something worse. He paused. I do not know, he said, who filed the anonymous complaint this hearing was called to consider. I have my suspicions. I will not name them, because I was not raised to name a man in a room like this one without proof I could stand behind. But I will say this. The complaint says, my birds have disturbed multiple neighbors. I have invited any of those neighbors to come forward this morning. None of them have. If any of them are in this room, I would ask them respectfully to stand up now and say to my face what they were unwilling to sign their own name to. He waited. No one stood. The silence in the room stretched. Barnett Sheffield's jaw moved once as though he had considered speaking and had reconsidered. Rowan looked at him. I have nothing else to say, Rowan said. The Bureau will decide what it will decide. He sat down. Isolde put her hand on his knee. Delphine on his other side was writing something in her notebook again, and Rowan could see without looking directly at her that her hand was steady in a way that he was quietly, deeply grateful for. Then Perry Caldwell stood up. Perry was 65 years old, tall and thin, with the particular weathered face of a Missouri cattleman who had spent most of his working life outdoors. He was holding his hat in his hands. He had not planned, Rowan could tell, to speak. He had planned to sit and watch and go home. Something in what Rowan had just said had changed his mind. Mr. Sheffield, Perry said, may I say something? Barnett Sheffield had looked briefly like he wanted to say no. He had said the floor recognizes Perry Caldwell. Perry had cleared his throat. 6 days ago, he said, my calf pushed through a section of fence on my property and wandered nearly a mile toward Rowan Trask's north field. That was at 4:30 in the morning. Rowan called me at 4:42. He told me his geese had sounded an alarm at 4:30. He told me his south flock was watching something on his cattle trail and he was going out to look. When he got there, he found my calf. He called me. He met me at the trail. We walked that calf back home together, and it was on my truck bed by 6 in the morning. He looked at the Bureau bench. That calf, Perry said, would have been in Rowan's elderberry field by 5, would have damaged plants he could not afford to lose, would have created a real problem for him and a real problem for me, and I would not have known where my calf was until I did chores at 7 and found the fence down. Rowan's geese found my calf, not his cameras, not his fence, his birds. I do not know what this Bureau is being asked to decide about them today. I only know that a man in this county lost half a night of sleep 6 days ago to bring my animal home, and that he did it because his birds told him to, and I have not been able to think about it much since without wanting to say thank you in a way I could not figure out how to say until right now. He sat down. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Barnett Sheffield's smile was gone. He looked at his papers. He shuffled them. He said in a voice that had lost some of its earlier certainty, "Are there other members of the community who wish to speak?" Thurman Odell stood up. Thurman was the last person in that room Rowan would have predicted was going to speak, given the 4 months of feed store mockery Thurman had subjected him to, and Rowan watched with the particular quiet attention of a man about to hear something he did not expect. I laughed at Rowan Trask in my store 4 months ago, Thurman said. He was not looking at Rowan. He was looking at Barnett Sheffield. I laughed at him for buying birds. I laughed at him for the whole idea. I told him his security team needed training. I called him on the phone when an airplane flew over his farm and made a joke about it. I have been, to be honest with this room, the loudest laugh in Fairgrove County for 4 months about what Rowan Trask has been trying to do. He paused. I want to say something, he said, for the record, so that if this bureau decides against Rowan today, I do not have to spend the rest of my life knowing I did not say it. Rowan Trask is not a fool. He is not running an unregulated poultry operation. He is doing what farmers in this county have always done, which is trying to solve a problem the only way he knows how, and getting laughed at for it by people like me who did not have the courage to try anything new ourselves. If I had known when I laughed at him in March what I know sitting in this room today, I would not have laughed. I want that in the record. He sat down. Rowan could not look at him. He looked at his hands. He looked at Isolde, who had put her hand over her mouth and was not moving. He looked at Delphine, who was writing something in her notebook with a hand that was not steady anymore. Barnett Sheffield cleared his throat. He said, "If there are no further comments from the community, this bureau will move to deliberation." Alden Whitmore stood up. That was the moment Rowan understood, with a clarity that felt almost like something breaking loose inside his chest, that whatever was happening in this room was no longer his to control, and that things he had spent the previous 4 months believing to be true about his standing in this county were apparently not quite as true as he had believed them to be. Alden was holding his folder. "Mr. Sheffield," he said, "I am here in my personal capacity, not as a representative of Fairgrove Farmers and Merchants Bank. But I have been Rowan Trask's loan officer for 11 years. I called him in October to tell him that if this year's harvest did not come in strong, we were going to have to restructure his note against the entire farm. I did not enjoy making that call. I have not enjoyed thinking about it since. I have watched Rowan Trask for the last 8 months do everything I have ever seen a farmer do to save his own ground. I have watched him sell his father's tractor. I have watched him spend his last $2,000 on birds his neighbors laughed at. I have watched him drive his own fences and rebuild his own gates and lose sleep I would not have lost in his position. I do not know if his birds are going to save his harvest this year. But I know that if this bureau decides today that he cannot keep those birds, Fairgrove Farmers and Merchants Bank is going to have to make a decision this fall about a farm that has been in the Trask family for 4 generations. And I want the bureau to think about that before it votes." He sat down. The silence in the room was different again. Barnett Sheffield did not move for a long moment. He looked at his papers. He looked at the bureau members seated beside him. He looked finally at Rowan Trask. Something in his face had changed, not softened. Rowan did not think Barnett Sheffield's face was capable of softening. But something in the certainty of the smile had gone, and what was left underneath was, Rowan realized, with something close to pity, the face of a man who had walked into this room expecting to finish at last a fight his father had lost in 1984, and had discovered that the fight was not in fact being watched by the audience he had spent 2 weeks assembling. "This bureau," he said, and his voice was measured, now careful, "will take the community's comments under advisement. We will render a written decision within 7 business days. This hearing is adjourned." He stood. He did not look at Rowan again. He gathered his papers, and he walked out through the side door, and the room began slowly to break up around him, and Rowan sat there in the second row with his wife's hand on his knee and his daughter's shoulder against his own, and he did not move for a long time because he did not entirely trust his legs to hold him if he tried to stand. Perry Caldwell came over to him. Perry did not say anything. He put his hand on Rowan's shoulder. He squeezed once. He walked away. Thurman Odell came over next. Thurman looked at Rowan. Thurman looked at Isolde. Thurman said, without any of the humor that had always been in his voice at the feed store, "I owe you an apology, Rowan. I would like to buy you a cup of coffee sometime this week, so I can give it to you properly." Rowan nodded. He could not speak yet. Thurman patted him once on the shoulder and walked away. Alden Whitmore was the last to come. He stood in front of Rowan for a moment before he spoke. "Rowan, Alden, I would not have been able to sit through that hearing without saying what I said. I need you to understand that. What I said was true when I said it in October, and it is still true. If this year's harvest does not come in, we are going to have hard conversations this fall. That has not changed. But I wanted the room to know what I know, which is that I have never seen a farmer work harder than you have worked this year to keep his ground, and I did not want that fact to be missing from the record." He held out his hand. Rowan stood finally and shook it. "Thank you, Alden." "Do not thank me. I only said what I saw." He nodded to Isolde. He nodded to Delphine. He walked out of the room. Winona Lark came over last. She had put her notebook away. She was holding her pen loosely in her hand. Mr. Trask, Miss Lark, I would like to write about what happened in this room today, not just the outcome of the vote. What happened in this room? I would like to sit down with you when you are ready. Whenever that is. I am not in a hurry. Rowan looked at her. He looked at Delphine. Delphine nodded once without looking at him. Next week, Rowan said, after the written decision comes. Next week, Winona agreed. She left. Rowan and Isolde and Delphine walked out of the Farm Bureau building into the June sunlight, and none of them said anything for a long moment because there was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said by other people in that room. Then Delphine, standing beside her father's truck, had reached over and taken his hand. Dad, I know. I am not going back to St. Louis on Sunday. He had looked at her. I am staying through harvest, she had said. I already talked to my firm. I already told them. I am not asking you if that is okay. I am telling you. Because I want to be here when your birds do what Grandpa Ellis said they were going to do. And I want to be here when Barnett Sheffield has to write a letter saying you can keep them. And I want to be here in August when you and Mom sit down with Alden Whitmore and tell him what this harvest looked like. I am staying. Rowan had not been able to answer. He had pulled his daughter against him. He had held her in the parking lot of the Fairgrove County Farm Bureau building for a long time. Isolde had stood beside them, one hand on her husband's back and one hand on her daughter's shoulder, and had said nothing at all. The written decision came on a Wednesday, 6 days later. The Bureau found insufficient evidence to support the complaint. The Bureau declined to take further action against the Trask farm. The Bureau recommended that any future noise concerns be addressed through direct communication between neighbors before formal complaints were filed. Rowan had read the letter 3 times. He had shown it to Isolde. He had shown it to Delphine. He had put it in the drawer beside the bed on top of his father's notebook, and he had closed the drawer and he had gone back out to check on the north flock. The rest of the summer had come and gone in the particular rhythm of a Missouri farm in the weeks leading up to elderberry harvest. The fruit had turned from green to red to a deep, dark purple that pulled the branches toward the ground. The crews had been scheduled. The coolers had been cleaned. The orders had been confirmed. The animals outside the farm had begun paying attention. The cameras had recorded deer near the creek 4 nights in a row. They had stayed outside the field. Then the tracks had appeared near the north fence. Rowan had added another camera. The next morning the video had shown a doe walking the entire edge just after midnight. She had stopped twice near the drainage area. That was the weakest point. Rowan had repaired it. For several days, nothing had happened. Then had come the night when the north flock had started screaming at 1:47 in the morning. Rowan had sat up. He had listened for 3 seconds. He had reached for the jeans folded over the chair. Isolde had turned on the lamp. Her hair had been loose against the pillow. Her eyes had carried the particular alertness of a woman who had learned over 40 years of marriage that when her husband moved that fast in the middle of the night, the reason mattered. What is it? The north flock. That does not tell me anything. It tells me enough. He had grabbed the flashlight. He had stepped onto the porch. He had looked toward the dark line of elderberry rows beyond the barn. The geese had still been going, all 14 of them on the north side. Same direction, same rhythm. He had driven out without turning on the radio. By the time he had reached the north field, the geese had gathered against the temporary fence, necks stretched high, wings half open, every bird staring toward the narrow strip of brush between the elderberries and the creek. He had stepped out. The geese had gotten louder. He had aimed his flashlight across the row. At first he had seen nothing. Then a branch had moved, not from the wind. 2 sets of eyes had reflected back at him. Then a third. 3 white-tailed deer had stood just beyond the field. One had already found the opening where storm runoff had weakened the bottom of the outer fence. Another few minutes, and they would have been inside. By sunrise, Rowan had repaired the gap with new wire and steel posts. The geese had gone quiet. They had been standing around their water trough like nothing had happened. He had walked back to the house. Isolde had been in the kitchen. The kettle had been on. Delphine had been at the table in her bathrobe, her hair pulled back, waiting for him. How many? Isolde had asked. 3. They had found the drainage gap. They were maybe 5 minutes from being inside. Delphine had closed her eyes for a moment. Isolde had put a cup of coffee in front of him. None of them had said anything else for a long time. 6 days later at 4:30 in the morning, the south flock had sounded off and Rowan had gone out and found a lost calf on the cattle trail and had made the call to Perry Caldwell that Perry had weeks earlier described in a Farm Bureau hearing room in front of 40 of their neighbors. The harvest had come in early September, on time and complete. The fruit had been heavy. The processing company out of Springfield had paid on the same schedule they had paid every year, and the local food business had paid on delivery. And by the second week of September, Rowan Trask had done what he had not done in 3 years. He had walked into the Fairgrove Farmers and Merchants Bank with a cashier's check in his hand, and he had paid off the balance of the equipment note in full with $3,000 to spare. Alden Whitmore had been at his desk. He had looked up when Rowan came in. He had stood. He had shaken Rowan's hand across the desk, and he had said quietly, "I am glad to see this money, Rowan. I am glad in a way I do not often get to be glad in this job. I know you are Alden. I want you to know I would have been fair with you either way. I know that too." They had stood a moment longer. Then Alden had said, "Your father would have been proud of you this year, Rowan." Rowan had not been able to answer. He had nodded. He had walked out. Barnett Sheffield had come to the farm in the middle of October. Rowan had not expected him. He had been out at the North Flock checking the water trough when he had seen Sheffield's truck turn up the drive, and he had watched Sheffield park and get out and walk toward him across the yard with his hat in his hands, and Rowan had understood before Sheffield had said a single word exactly what he had come to say. "Rowan, Barnett, I lost 20% of my soybean field this year to deer. That is not a number I have shared with anyone. I am sharing it with you now because I want you to know why I am standing on your farm today." Rowan had looked at him a long moment. "You came to ask about the birds." "I came to ask about the birds." Rowan had looked at his flock. He had looked at the elderberry rows behind them, tired now, most of the fruit gone empty stems where the heavy clusters had been cut. He had thought about 1984. He had thought about 14 votes. He had thought about the smile in the feed store, and the anonymous complaint, and the hearing room, and the smile that had finally gone away. He had thought about what his father would have done. "Come up to the porch, Barnett. Isolde has coffee on." Barnett Sheffield had looked at him for a long moment. He had put his hat back on. The two of them had walked together up the gravel drive past the equipment shed where the old International Harvester tractor had once sat, and no longer did past the North Flock enclosure where 14 geese were settling into an autumn evening up onto the porch, where Isolde had already come out with a fresh pot of coffee and 3 cups because she had seen Barnett's truck from the kitchen window and had already known what was coming. They had sat on the porch for the better part of an hour. Rowan had told him what he knew about the birds, how to buy them, how to place them, how to read what they were saying. He had told him about the notebook. He had not shown it to him, but he had told him about it. He had told him about the middle passage. He had told him what Ellis had written, which was that machines only hear a thing after it has already broken. Barnett Sheffield had listened. He had said at one point, "I did not know your father wrote any of that down. He never told anyone. It took me 9 years after he passed to find the notebook. He was a better man than my father was, Rowan. I have known that for a long time. I have not always known how to say it." Rowan had not answered. He had refilled Barnett's coffee. They had sat on the porch a little longer, and then Barnett had stood, and he had thanked Isolde for the coffee, and he had walked back to his truck, and he had driven away, and Rowan and Isolde had stayed on the porch a while longer as the light faded. Delphine had come out eventually. She had a mug in her hand. She had sat down on the top step at her father's feet the way she had sat there when she was 10 and 11, and every year afterward when she had come home for a visit and had, without ever making a decision about it, defaulted back into the same physical position she had held on this porch since she had been a child. "You keeping them," she had said, "all of them, through winter?" "I think so. All 20. Maybe not all 20. Enough." One of the geese had started calling. Another had answered. Isolde had listened. "Should we check?" Rowan had shaken his head. "That is Thurman's truck." A few seconds later, a pickup had come around the bend. Isolde had smiled. "You can tell now." Delphine had looked up at her father. Rowan had looked out across the elderberry rows, at the tired plants, at the empty stems where heavy clusters had once been. He had thought about his father Ellis, 91 years old, dying in the front bedroom with an unfinished sentence in his mouth. He had thought about the notebook. He had thought about the middle passage. He had thought about all the things a man learns over a long life on a piece of ground his family has kept for 4 generations, and about how many of those things do not come from books or from equipment or from money in the bank, but from listening to something that cannot speak long enough that you finally learned to hear it. Machines only hear a thing after it is already broken, he had said quietly. Isolde had reached over and taken his hand. Delphine had leaned her head against his knee. The three of them had stayed on the porch a long time after that, watching the light fade over the north field, listening to the geese settle in for the evening, and none of them had said anything else because there was not anything else that needed to be said. Somewhere in the drawer beside the bed, wrapped in an oilcloth that had gone stiff with age, a small leather-bound notebook rested on top of a letter from the Fairgrove County Farm Bureau that had 6 months earlier found insufficient evidence to support a complaint an old friend of Ellis Trask's old enemy had filed against his son. Outside, the geese moved through the tall grass beyond the barn. They were quiet. That was what he wanted. But when they raised their voices, Rowe and Trask paid attention. Because the real lesson had never been that geese were better than cameras. They were not. The lesson was that farms worked best when different tools did different jobs. Technology could record. Fences could delay. People could decide. And sometimes when the light was low and the wind was moving through the elderberry rows and a small flock of loud, stubborn birds began to call in a rhythm that a man had spent an entire summer learning to read, that same man could climb into his pickup at 1:47 in the morning and find at the edge of his own north field 3 white-tailed deer that had been about to cost him everything, standing on the wrong side of a fence he had repaired the previous week, and turn them back before they took a single berry off a single plant. His father had known. Ellis Trask had known. And Rowan Trask, at 62 years old, had finally finished a sentence his father had not lived long enough to finish himself,